Between 1868 and 1876, the road connecting Philadelphia to Pittsburgh was a vital artery of post-Civil War American commerce. Hundreds of travelers traversed this route weekly, merchants, workers, families seeking new opportunities. While precise statistics from the era don't exist, reports from local authorities suggest that a significant portion of travelers faced difficulties during their journeys. Some changed routes, others suffered accidents, and many simply disappeared without a trace. But on a specific stretch of this road, something far more sinister was happening. Harrowgate Inn stood like an oasis for exhausted travelers, a robust wooden construction, always perfumed by the tempting aroma of roasted meat and the comforting sound of well-fed pigs in the back of the property. For nearly a decade, this inn maintained an impeccable reputation. Hearty meals, clean accommodations, and generous hosts who never refused shelter to those in need. What no one imagined was that behind this facade of rural hospitality operated one of the most macabre criminal operations in American history, a discovery that would reveal not only mass murders, but a practice that would forever transform how people viewed trust between strangers. Today, we're going to investigate the events that led to the discovery of Harrowgate Inn's secret, a story that questions how far human evil can go when disguised as kindness. Before we begin, tell me in the comments, what type of content would you like to see more of on the channel? Corrupt institutions, macabre family stories, or unsolved crimes? And if this is your first time on Fear Files, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any investigation like this one. Harrowgate Inn occupied a strategic position on the road between Philadelphia and Pittsburgh, exactly at the point where travelers began to feel the fatigue of the first leg of their journey. Walton Harrowgate, a robust man in his early 40s, had built the establishment with his own hands in 1867. His wife, Susan, a woman of maternal appearance and warm smile, tended to the kitchen with a dedication that impressed all guests. The couple quickly gained a reputation in the region. Local merchants praised the quality of the smoked sausages that Susan produced, sold not only at the inn but also to families in the surrounding areas. The secret, according to her, lay in the special mixture of spices and the smoking process that lasted for days. The pigs raised in the back of the property were fed with food scraps and grew exceptionally fat and healthy, providing the base for the products that made Susan famous in the region. During meals, Susan had the peculiar habit of closely observing guests while they ate. She asked detailed questions about the taste of the meat, whether it was tender enough, whether the seasoning was to each person's liking. Some travelers commented that she seemed almost anxious for approval, as if each compliment were a deep personal validation. When someone particularly praised the meat, Susan smiled in a way that some later described as strangely satisfied. The inn's architecture reflected the couple's growing prosperity. What had begun as a simple structure was gradually expanded with new rooms, a larger dining room, and improved facilities. Walton had built a spacious basement that he claimed to use for food and wine storage, but which he always kept locked, explaining that it contained his most valuable trade secrets. The inn's solid construction muffled sounds coming from the basement, a characteristic that Walton proudly mentioned as proof of the quality of his construction. Susan developed a meticulous routine for meal preparation, always insisting on personally preparing the main dishes for guests she considered special. She maintained a well-organized pantry, but some visitors noticed that certain areas were kept under lock and key, with Susan explaining that she stored her rarest and most valuable spices there. The kitchen was equipped with exceptionally sharp knives and cutting equipment that seemed more appropriate for a professional butcher shop than for a simple inn. Travelers who stopped at the inn frequently commented on the couple's generosity. Walton never charged abusive prices, even when guests arrived late at night or in precarious conditions. Susan always prepared extra meals for those who seemed hungry, and her sausages were offered as a courtesy to travelers who showed appreciation for the hospitality received. The inn became a mandatory stop for those who knew the route. What drew attention, however, was the constant turnover of guests. Unlike other inns in the region where travelers frequently returned and created bonds with the owners, at Harrowgate, The same face was rarely seen twice. Walton explained this by saying that his inn mainly attracted people passing through, traveling salesmen, seasonal workers, war orphans seeking new opportunities. The nearest neighbors, who lived several miles away, occasionally noticed nighttime movement on the property. Carriages arrived at nightfall, and the following morning they frequently departed very early, even before sunrise. Walton justified these schedules by explaining that many travelers preferred to take advantage of the cooler hours of the day to continue their journeys, especially during the summer months. A detail that few noticed, but which would become significant later, was that Walton always insisted on personally helping guests unload their luggage. He claimed it was a courtesy, but attentive observers noted that he seemed to carefully evaluate the weight and content of the bags, asking subtle questions about what the travelers were carrying. Some guests mentioned that he showed particular interest in those traveling with valuables or valuable merchandise. The couple had developed a hospitality system that seemed almost theatrical in its perfection. Susan always received guests with an impeccably clean apron and a warm smile, while Walton presented himself as the ideal host, offering help with luggage and information about the road ahead. They seemed to have rehearsed their interactions, with each playing their role consistently and convincingly. Some guests commented that the hospitality was so perfect, it seemed almost artificial, but attributed this impression to the couple's exceptional professionalism. The inn's prosperity was evident. Despite being located in a relatively isolated area, the couple managed to maintain a comfortable standard of living. Their clothes were always well maintained, the property was constantly in good repair, and they never seemed to face financial difficulties, even during periods when other inns in the region reported low guest traffic. Susan developed a particular reputation for her culinary skill. Her meals were described as unforgettable by those who experienced them. The meat served had a unique flavor, sweeter and more tender than usual, which she attributed to the superior quality of the animals raised on the property and the special preparation methods she had learned from her mother. Many guests asked to take sausages for their journey, and Susan always fulfilled these requests with apparent satisfaction. During colder nights, when the wind blew in the right direction, distant neighbors occasionally heard strange sounds coming from the property. These were noises that seemed like muffled screams or groans, but when questioned, the Harrogates explained that they were just the animals feeding or fighting among themselves during the night. The explanation was accepted, as it was known that farm animals could be noisy, especially when excited by food. Documents from the era show that Harrowgate Inn was officially registered and paid its taxes on time. Walton kept a record book where he noted the names of guests, their origins and destinations. This book, which would later become a crucial piece in the investigation, showed a constant flow of people, most identified only by first names or nicknames, coming from various cities and heading to varied destinations. The couple's reputation extended beyond hospitality. They were seen as respectable members of the region's dispersed rural community. Susan occasionally participated in social events in nearby towns, always bringing her famous sausages as a contribution. Walton was known for helping travelers with problems with their carriages, offering tools and knowledge for small repairs. During the first years of operation, no significant incidents were reported at the inn. There were no complaints of theft, inappropriate behavior, or problems with service quality. On the contrary, the few comments recorded in local newspapers or personal letters from the era always praised the experience at Harrowgate Inn. It was, by all available indicators, a model establishment. The only characteristic that could be considered unusual was the couple's insistence that guests try their culinary specialties. Susan frequently prepared special dishes that weren't requested, especially for travelers who seemed particularly tired or hungry. Walton had the habit of offering alcoholic beverages as a courtesy, especially a homemade brandy that he said was a family recipe known for helping travelers relax after long journeys. The first sign that something might be wrong emerged in the winter of 1874, when a textile merchant from Philadelphia sought local authorities reporting the disappearance of his partner. The man had departed for Pittsburgh carrying a significant amount of merchandise and money with scheduled stops at various inns along the route. His last confirmed location had been near the region where Harrowgate Inn was situated. When questioned, Walton confirmed that the merchant had spent a night at his inn, but assured that the man had departed the following morning. Apparently satisfied with the services received, he showed the entry in the guest book, where only H. Merchant, Philadelphia to Pittsburgh was recorded. The investigation didn't advance, as traveler disappearances were relatively common at the time, attributed to robberies, accidents, or spontaneous plan changes. During this period, Susan began to demonstrate increasingly peculiar behavior regarding meal preparation. She developed special recipes for specific guests, claiming she could identify people's culinary preferences just by observing them. Some travelers reported that she asked strange questions about their eating habits, whether they had family waiting for them, and whether anyone would know if they didn't reach their destination on the expected schedule. Susan's behavior during meals became progressively more intense. She began making notes in a small notebook about guests' reactions to the food, recording details about their facial expressions and comments. When questioned about these notes, she explained that she was developing a scientific system to perfect her recipes based on customer feedback. Some guests noticed that she seemed particularly interested in observing people who excessively praised the meat, as if she were studying their reactions. Walton developed the habit of having long conversations with solitary guests, especially those who seemed to have no close family connections. He showed genuine interest in their personal stories, asking about their families, destinations, and future plans. Some travelers commented that he seemed to memorize specific details about their lives, asking follow-up questions that demonstrated unusual attention to strangers' personal details. During 1875, a pattern began to emerge, although no one yet perceived it clearly. Families in cities along the route began reporting unreceived letters from relatives who had departed on business trips or moves. These letters should have been sent from Pittsburgh or intermediate cities but never reached their recipients. When investigated, it was discovered that the senders had never reached their final destinations. A particularly disturbing incident occurred when a German immigrant family traveling with 3 small children was last seen in the region of Harrowgate Inn. They had stopped in a previous town where they bought supplies and mentioned their intention to spend the night at the inn before continuing to Pittsburgh, where the father had secured work at a factory. The family never reached their destination, and their possessions were never found. At this time, neighbors began to notice that Susan had developed the habit of making special deliveries of sausages to families in the region, always insisting they try her latest recipes. She seemed particularly interested in people's reactions when tasting the meat, asking detailed questions about the flavor and closely observing their expressions. Some people commented that she seemed disappointed when someone didn't show sufficient enthusiasm for the food. During this period, Susan began keeping a detailed record of her sausage sales, noting not only quantities and prices, but also the specific reactions of each customer. She developed a classification system for her customers based on their responses to the food, categorizing them as refined appreciators or common palates. Customers who particularly praised her sausages received special treatment, with Susan offering exclusive varieties that she claimed to be developing only for true connoisseurs. The inn began to attract a specific type of clientele that worried some local observers. Many of the guests were people who traveled alone, carried few personal belongings, and seemed to have few social connections. Walton seemed to have developed a special ability to identify these vulnerable travelers, offering them extra hospitality and showing particular interest in their personal circumstances. Walton and Susan maintained their consistent explanations. When questioned about specific guests, they always confirmed that people had passed through the inn but invariably had departed early before dawn to take advantage of the cooler hours of the day. They showed records in their book, although the notes were always vague and rarely included complete surnames or detailed information about the travelers. The quality of meals at the inn continued to impress guests. Susan developed an even greater reputation for her sausages, which were now sought after by people from distant cities. She began producing larger quantities, selling to local butcher shops, and even sending orders to customers in Philadelphia. The demand was so great that she frequently apologized for not being able to fulfill all orders. During this period, some guests began reporting strange experiences during their stays. Several mentioned having extremely vivid and disturbing dreams after dining at the inn, dreams that involved sensations of being watched or pursued. Others reported waking during the night with the feeling that someone had been in their rooms, although nothing was missing. When questioned, the Harrowgates attributed these reports to travel fatigue and the effects of the homemade brandy. During this period, some neighbors began to notice a strange odor coming from the direction of the inn, especially during the night. The smell was described as a mixture of burned meat and something sweet and nauseating. When questioned, the Harrowgates explained that they were experimenting with new smoking methods for their sausages, which required long and intensive processes during nighttime hours. A particularly unsettling event occurred when an itinerant pastor who had spent a night at the inn returned several weeks later looking for a family Bible he had forgotten. Walton and Susan denied having found any Bible, but the pastor insisted he had left it in his room. During the discussion, he mentioned having noticed an unusual taste in the meat served during his previous stay, describing it as too sweet to be common pork. At this time, Susan developed the disturbing habit of collecting small personal objects that guests forgot: buttons, small jewelry, personal letters. She claimed to keep these items in case the owners returned looking for them. But neighbors noticed that she seemed to have a strange emotional attachment to these objects, frequently handling and examining them when she thought no one was watching. The inn's sausage sales continued to grow, and Susan began receiving orders from establishments in larger cities. She developed different varieties, each with unique flavors that she attributed to special spice mixtures and preparation techniques that she kept secret. Customers frequently commented that they had never experienced sausages with such distinct and memorable flavors. Movement at the inn remained constant, but neighbors began to notice that they rarely saw the same travelers returning on the road. At other inns in the region, it was common to see regular merchants who made the route several times a year, creating relationships with the owners. At Harrowgate, this never happened. All guests seemed to be unique travelers, people who passed once and were never seen again. During late 1875, an incident almost exposed the operation prematurely. A group of 3 merchants had stopped at the inn, but one of them decided to continue the journey the same night, claiming urgency in his business. The other 2 stayed to spend the night. When the 3rd merchant arrived in Pittsburgh, he waited for his companions for several days. Worried, he returned along the road looking for them. But Walton insisted that the men had departed the following morning, right after their companion. Susan's insistence that guests try her culinary specialties became more pronounced. She frequently prepared unrequested dishes, especially for travelers who arrived alone or seemed to carry significant valuables. Walton developed the habit of offering his homemade brandy as a courtesy, especially to guests who showed extreme fatigue or mentioned long journeys ahead. If you're enjoying this disturbing investigation, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and activate notifications. We still have much more to discover about the macabre secrets of Harrowgate Inn. In March 1877, Cornelius Brennan, a young blacksmith's apprentice of only 19 years, departed from a small town near Philadelphia, heading to Pittsburgh, where he had secured a position at a metalwork shop. Unlike many solitary travelers of the era, Cornelius had family who cared about his well-being and expected regular news of his journey. He had promised to send a letter as soon as he reached his destination, confirming his arrival and the start of his new job. The Brennan family waited patiently for 2 weeks after the expected date of his arrival. When no news came, Simon Brennan, Cornelius's older brother and a determined man with connections in the local community, decided to investigate personally. He retraced the route that Cornelius should have followed, stopping at each inn and establishment along the way to ask about his brother. The investigation led Simon to Harrowgate Inn, where Walton confirmed that the young man had spent a night at his establishment. According to the record, Cornelius had arrived at nightfall, dined, slept, and departed before dawn. Walton showed the entry in the book, C. Brennan, blacksmith apprentice to Pittsburgh. The record was perfectly normal, and Walton's explanation was plausible. But something about the couple's behavior bothered Simon. He couldn't identify exactly what it was, but his older brother's intuition, developed over years of protecting Cornelius, told him something was wrong. During this conversation, Simon noticed something disturbing about Susan's behavior. When he described his brother in detail, his height, hair color, a specific scar on his face, Susan demonstrated surprisingly detailed knowledge about the young man's appearance. Much more than would be expected from someone who had briefly interacted with a guest weeks before. She even mentioned that Cornelius had particularly praised the meat served at dinner, a specific detail that seemed strangely important to her. Simon noticed that Susan seemed nervous during the conversation, constantly fidgeting with her apron and avoiding direct eye contact. She made several attempts to change the subject, offering him food and drink and demonstrating excessive hospitality that contrasted with her apparent anxiety. When he mentioned that he intended to continue searching for Cornelius, Susan insistently suggested that he should accept that some travelers simply choose to disappear to start new lives. Walton, in turn, demonstrated unusual interest in the investigation details, asking questions about who else Simon had approached and whether he had shared his suspicions with authorities. He offered help with the search, but in a way that seemed more interested in controlling the investigation than genuinely helping. Simon noticed that Walton seemed to be evaluating whether he represented a threat to the inn's operation. Although he couldn't prove anything specific, Simon left the inn with the certainty that something was terribly wrong. He decided to continue the investigation, visiting Pittsburgh and confirming that his brother had never arrived at the shop where he was supposed to work. This confirmation transformed his suspicions into a determination to discover the truth. During his investigations throughout the region, Simon began connecting apparently unrelated information. Talking with other inn owners, he discovered that several of them had noticed a decrease in the number of regular travelers who used to make the route. Merchants who previously passed through the region monthly had simply stopped appearing without explanation. Even more disturbing, Simon discovered that at least 6 families in different cities along the route were searching for missing relatives. All had departed toward Pittsburgh in the last 2 years and never reached their destination. When Simon mapped the dates and routes, he realized that all the disappearances had one point in common: the region where Harrowgate Inn was located. During his investigations, Simon made a discovery that left him even more alarmed. Talking with residents of cities along the route, he discovered that occasionally personal belongings of travelers were found in locations several miles away from Harrowgate Inn, an abandoned suitcase here, scattered clothes there, always at points that suggested the travelers had encountered problems long after leaving the inn. These findings always reinforced the narrative that the disappearances occurred in other locations, not in the inn's region. The most disturbing discovery came when Simon spoke with a farmer who had found an abandoned carriage several miles away from the inn, with signs that it had been deliberately left there. The farmer mentioned that, curiously, Walton Harrowgate had appeared the next day offering help to remove the vehicle, claiming it probably belonged to a traveler who had suffered an accident. At the time, the gesture had seemed helpful, but now it gained a sinister meaning. Determined to discover the truth, Simon sought local authorities and presented his findings about the pattern of disappearances. Initially, the officers showed reluctance, as the Harrowgates were considered respectable citizens with no history of problems. However, Simon's persistence and systematic presentation of evidence about multiple disappearances concentrated in the same region eventually convinced the authorities to take action. The first official search at Harrowgate Inn was conducted discreetly. The investigators arrived during the day, presenting themselves as public health inspectors interested in verifying food storage conditions. Walton and Susan received the visitors with their usual hospitality, offering tours of the property and detailed explanations about their food preparation methods. During the inspection, investigators noticed several subtle anomalies. The breeding area at the back of the property was exceptionally well maintained, but the soil around it was stained in a way that didn't seem consistent with just animal waste. The animals were indeed exceptionally large and well-fed, but their behavior seemed agitated and aggressive when people approached. One of the investigators made a disturbing discovery when he examined the farm animals more closely. Some had small pieces of cloth and buttons mixed with dirt around their mouths, plus small metallic objects that appeared to be fragments of buckles and jewelry scattered throughout the area where they fed. When questioned about this, Susan nervously explained that the animals sometimes found objects lost by travelers around the property. The investigators noticed that Susan demonstrated unusual technical knowledge about meat processing, using terminology that would be more appropriate for a professional butcher than for an inn cook. She described cutting and preparation techniques that seemed excessively detailed and specific, especially when discussing methods to make use of every part of slaughtered animals. Her passion for the subject seemed to go beyond normal culinary interest. During the kitchen inspection, investigators discovered a collection of knives and cutting instruments that were exceptionally sharp and well-maintained. Susan explained that the quality of the instruments was essential for her work, but the quantity and variety of tools seemed excessive for an inn's needs. Some of the instruments were specialized for specific types of cutting that wouldn't be necessary for conventional culinary preparation. In the food preparation area, investigators found meat processing equipment more sophisticated than would be expected for a simple inn. Susan explained that sausage production had become a profitable business, justifying the investment in better equipment. She proudly demonstrated her grinding and seasoning techniques. But investigators noticed that some of the equipment seemed to have been used to process much larger quantities of meat than would be necessary just for the inn's guests. The decisive moment came when one of the investigators, examining the record book more carefully, noticed that many of the entries seemed to have been made by the same person, despite supposedly representing different guests recording their own information. Additionally, the ink and handwriting were too consistent to represent records made over several years by different people. During the basement inspection, investigators made a discovery that would change everything. Hidden behind grain sacks, they found a chest containing dozens of personal documents, unsent letters, and small valuable objects. Among these items were Cornelius's identification papers, including a letter he had written to his family but never sent. Describing his arrival at the inn and praising the host's hospitality, confronted with these discrepancies, Walton and Susan maintained their explanations, but began showing signs of nervousness. Susan, in particular, became defensive when questioned about the specific methods of obtaining meat for her sausages. She insisted that all meat came from animals raised on the property, but couldn't satisfactorily explain how she managed to produce such large quantities of sausages with only the animals visible in the breeding area. The investigation took a decisive turn when officers decided to examine the breeding area more thoroughly. Superficial excavations in the soil around the area revealed bone fragments that were clearly not from common animal origin. Some of the fragments were recognizably human, including parts of skulls and long bones that had been partially gnawed. The discovery of human bones transformed the investigation from a search for missing persons into a multiple homicide investigation. Walton and Susan were immediately arrested and a complete search of the property was initiated. What investigators found exceeded their worst expectations and revealed the complete extent of the macabre operation that had functioned for nearly a decade. In the inn's basement, investigators discovered a disturbing collection of personal belongings, suitcases, clothes, jewelry, identity documents, money, and personal objects that clearly belonged to dozens of different people. Among the items found were children's toys, indicating that entire families had been victims of the operation. Analysis of the meat processing equipment revealed traces of human blood and tissue fragments that were not consistent with animal meat. The meat grinder, in particular, contained residues that confirmed it had been used to process human meat. Susan's famous sausages, which had been sold and consumed by hundreds of people in the region, contained a mixture of pork and human meat. The interrogations of Walton and Susan Harrowgate revealed a criminal operation of sophistication and coldness that shocked even experienced investigators. Initially, both denied any involvement in criminal activities, maintaining that they were honest inn owners who had been misunderstood. However, when confronted with the physical evidence found on the property, their stories began to crumble. Walton was the first to break under pressure. During the third day of interrogation, he admitted that he had killed travelers, but initially claimed they were just a few isolated cases of self-defense against guests who tried to rob the inn. This version quickly proved unsustainable when confronted with the amount of evidence found on the property. During the interrogations, Susan revealed disturbing details about how she developed her taste for human flesh. She described with shocking coldness how she discovered that human meat had a more refined taste than animal meat, especially when prepared with the right spices. She even mentioned that different parts of the human body had distinct flavors, and that she had developed specific preferences based on the age and physical condition of the victims. Susan demonstrated disturbingly detailed knowledge about human anatomy, describing how different muscles and organs should be prepared to obtain the best culinary results. She spoke about her victims as if they were ingredients in a recipe, referring to them by physical characteristics that affected the meat's flavor. Investigators noted that she seemed genuinely proud of her culinary expertise, demonstrating a complete lack of understanding about the horrific nature of her actions. During the interrogations, it was revealed that Susan kept detailed notes about each victim, including information about their diet, age, physical condition, and even emotional state at the time of death. She believed these factors directly influenced the meat's quality and had developed a complex system to categorize her victims based on these characteristics. This scientific system demonstrated the level of planning and premeditation involved in their crimes. Walton revealed that he had developed specific techniques to identify ideal victims, observing signs like the quality of their clothes, the amount of luggage they carried, and especially their social situation. He preferred targets who traveled alone, had no close family connections, or were in transition between jobs or cities. This careful selection ensured that disappearances wouldn't be immediately investigated. The true extent of the operation was gradually revealed. Walton and Susan had developed a meticulous system to identify, attract, and eliminate travelers they considered ideal targets. They prioritized people who traveled alone, carried significant valuables, and whose absence wouldn't be immediately noticed. Solitary merchants, migrant workers, war orphans, and newly arrived immigrants were preferred targets. The method of operation was consistent and calculated. Susan prepared special dinners for selected guests, always including Walton's homemade brandy. The drink was adulterated with a mixture of herbs and substances that caused deep drowsiness and disorientation. Once the victims were incapacitated, Walton took them to the basement where he killed them with hammer blows to the head. During the interrogations, Walton revealed macabre details about how he perfected his murder methods over the years. He described how he learned to calculate the exact dose of substances to incapacitate victims without killing them immediately. As Susan insisted that the meat had better quality when the animal, as she referred to the victims, died in a specific way. He also developed techniques to minimize bleeding, facilitating the subsequent processing of the bodies. One of the most calculated aspects of the operation was how they dealt with evidence. Walton admitted that he frequently took victims' belongings to locations several miles away from the inn, scattering them along the road to create the impression that travelers had encountered problems elsewhere. He would even damage carriages and abandon them several miles away, always subsequently offering to help remove the vehicles. Reinforcing his image as a good Samaritan, Susan revealed that she had developed an elaborate system to process and store human meat. She maintained different processing areas for different types of meat and had perfected preservation techniques that allowed storing large quantities for long periods. She described with technical pride how she managed to mix human meat with pork in a way that the resulting flavor was not only palatable, but superior to conventional products. The bodies were then processed systematically. The less usable parts were fed to the farm animals, which had been conditioned to devour human flesh and bones. The more tender meat was separated, ground, and mixed with pork to produce the sausages that Susan sold to the local community. The couple had perfected seasoning and smoking techniques that masked any distinctive flavor of human meat. Susan revealed that she kept a culinary diary where she noted details about each victim and how their meat had been processed. She recorded age, physical condition, and even the emotional state of victims at the time of death, believing these factors affected the final flavor of the meat. The diary contained specific recipes for different types of human meat, with seasoning variations based on each victim's characteristics. During the interrogations, Susan revealed disturbing details about her motivation. She claimed to have developed a taste for human flesh during childhood, when her mother, in times of extreme poverty, had fed the family with meat of questionable origin. Susan described human meat as sweeter and more tender than animal meat, and expressed pride in the quality of her sausages, even knowing their macabre origin. Walton, in turn, admitted that the operation had begun almost by accident. The first murder occurred when a guest discovered money hidden in the inn and tried to steal it. Walton killed him in self-defense, but when Susan suggested feeding the body to the animals to avoid legal problems, they discovered that the animals devoured evidence efficiently. From there, the operation evolved into a profitable business. Investigators discovered that the couple had developed an elaborate system to dispose of evidence. Besides feeding parts of the bodies to the animals, they burned bones and other remains in a special furnace built at the back of the property. The ashes were then mixed with animal manure and used as fertilizer in the fields around the inn, literally making their victims become part of the local soil. During the interrogations, it was revealed that the couple had developed signs and codes between themselves to identify potential victims. Susan used different types of aprons to signal to Walton about guests she considered suitable targets, while Walton had specific gestures to indicate when he had identified an ideal victim. This silent communication allowed them to coordinate their crimes without raising suspicions from other guests. Walton admitted to developing a sadistic pleasure in the process of selecting and eliminating victims. He described how he enjoyed observing unsuspecting guests during their last meals, knowing that in a few hours they would be dead. He even mentioned that he sometimes prolonged conversations with victims, making them talk about their hopes and future plans, finding perverse satisfaction in knowing these dreams would never be realized. Analysis of the inn's records, combined with missing person reports from the region, allowed investigators to estimate that at least 27 people had been murdered at Harrowgate Inn between 1868 and 1877. The real number was probably slightly higher, as many travelers of the era didn't have families who would report their disappearances. Among the identified victims were merchants, artisans, agricultural workers, and at least 2 complete families, including small children. The belongings found in the basement allowed identification of some specific victims, including young Cornelius Brennan, whose personal documents were found among the confiscated objects. The most disturbing discovery was the revelation that the sausages produced by Susan had been sold and consumed by hundreds of people in the region over the years. Respectable families, including local authorities and clergy members, had unknowingly consumed human meat processed by the Harrowgate's operation. The news caused widespread panic and nausea in the community. During the trial, Susan demonstrated a complete lack of remorse for her actions. She even expressed frustration at no longer being able to prepare her special recipes and made comments about how people in the region had lost the opportunity to experience truly unique cuisine. Her defiant attitude and apparent pride in her crimes shocked even experienced observers of the judicial system. Investigators also discovered that the couple had kept trophies from some victims. Susan kept jewelry and personal objects she considered particularly beautiful or valuable. Walton had kept identity documents and personal letters, apparently as mementos of their victims. These items provided additional evidence about the identity of the murdered people. During the trial, the defense tried to plead insanity, arguing that Susan suffered from a mental condition that compelled her to consume human flesh and that Walton had been influenced by his wife. Psychiatrists of the era examined both defendants but concluded that, despite their macabre practices, they were mentally competent and fully aware of the criminal nature of their actions. The prosecution presented evidence that the operation was carefully planned and executed, demonstrating premeditation and criminal consciousness. The fact that the couple had maintained false records, hidden evidence, and continued to operate for nearly a decade showed that they perfectly understood they were committing serious crimes. Witnesses were called to testify about the quality of Susan's sausages and about interactions with the couple over the years. Many people reported having praised the food and having bought products from the inn, creating a collective feeling of horror and guilt in the community. The revelation that they had unknowingly participated in cannibalism caused lasting psychological trauma in many local residents, The trial also revealed that some neighbors had noticed suspicious signs over the years but had chosen to ignore them or rationalized the anomalies. Strange odors, the animal's behavior, the absence of regular guests, and the inn's inexplicable financial success were signs that, in retrospect, clearly pointed to criminal activities. The trial of Walton and Susan Harrowgate became one of the most notorious criminal cases in the region. Journalists from nearby cities traveled to follow the proceedings, and the macabre nature of the crimes generated intense discussions in taverns, churches, and homes throughout Pennsylvania. The discovery that human flesh had been sold and consumed by innocent community members created a collective horror that endured for generations. During the trial, additional details about the operation continued to emerge. Witnesses reported conversations with the couple over the years where Susan had made apparently innocent comments about her meat preparation methods that, in retrospect, gained sinister meanings. She had mentioned using special ingredients and secret family techniques that were now understood as veiled references to cannibalism. One of the most disturbing aspects revealed during the trial was the discovery that Susan had developed a regular clientele for her sausages, including families who placed specific orders for special occasions. Some of these families had served the sausages at weddings, baptisms, and other important celebrations, unknowingly transforming sacred moments into involuntary cannibal rituals. The trial revealed that Susan had maintained detailed correspondence with some of her regular customers, developing relationships that went beyond simple commercial transactions. She sent letters describing her new recipes and offering exclusive products to customers who showed particular appreciation for her sausages. These letters, found among the evidence, contained language that was now understood as veiled references to the human ingredients she used. The most shocking discovery was the revelation that Walton had developed a network of contacts who unknowingly helped him dispose of evidence. He cultivated relationships with local farmers and merchants, offering to help with problems like abandoned carriages or injured animals found on the road. These respectable community members had unknowingly participated in the operation by accepting Walton's help to remove evidence that he himself had planted several miles away from the inn. The local community faced a deep crisis of trust. Families who had consumed Susan's sausages reported psychosomatic symptoms, including persistent nausea and nightmares. Some residents developed lasting aversions to pork, unable to mentally separate the association with human flesh.